Hello and welcome to another episode. So today I would like for you to look at two photographs and study them for a few seconds and see if you can notice something. It should really kind of jump out at you as in this day and age is kind of being unorthodox. Okay, so please, this image on the right, if you'll take a few moments to study it and see if you can find something unusual. Okay, so let's go to the next image. Okay, if you can study this for a moment. Okay, so what I have here, and both of these images are so cool, I wanted to do this standalone video on exposure bracketing and multi-exposure HDR. So with this in mind, these two images in mind, okay, let's take a look at some notes I made here. Okay, so what we have here is 2005 and before. So both of these images, the point of making this video is both of these images that I showed you, they look like as if they were taken in the year 2005 or before. So let me explain. 2005 and before, we had film, okay, and it was binary. It was basically one exposure. You take your pick. So here what we have is we have a blown out beach. This is blown out, and Kaya Gerber is standing in shadow. So this photographer, again, we're going back, this photographer, it was a binary decision. Do I expose for Kaya in the shadow, or do I expose for this over here, this blown out area, or this bright area? The photographer chose to expose for the shadow, okay, because the model, Kaya, is standing in the shadow. Here, the photographer had another choice. Do I expose for the sun, or do I expose for the shadow? Right? Since the model in this image is standing in the sun, the photographer exposed for the sun. So let's get back to the notes. 2005 and before was film, and again, as I just showed, it was basically a binary, one exposure, either exposed for the sun or exposed for the shadow or shade. Okay, and what kind of mitigated that a little bit was in 1996, Nikon developed the F5, and then in 2004 the F6 came along. But what my point is, the meter in both the F5 and F6 were tremendous. They were just way beyond their time. They were much more advanced for 1996 and 2004 respectively. They were just brilliant light meters, and they could really nail the image. Now that's what these two photos look like. These look like film because of how dark the shadow is here and how bright the sun is here on this beach, right, with the palm trees and the sand. Okay, this looks like pre-2005 film. And so let me explain a little further. So when we got to 2006 and entered the age of digital, right, about roughly from 2006 to 2018, the emphasis was on digital editing with programs like software like Lightroom. Now, Photoshop, for instance, if, say, there was some type of a telephone wire or some type of electrical conduit here, Photoshop is used to remove that, right? Photoshop is used to remove tangibles, whereas Lightroom is for the intangibles. It's for color, temperature, tint, shadows, right, highlights, so forth and so on. So here it's variable. The exposure was variable, and you can take, right, you could take your sliders and adjust your image. So for here, right, this is a modern photo. It was taken recently, but my point is if you're using this from 2006 to 2018, you take your highlights and you drag your highlight slider left, and you can either use exposure or highlights, right, and you can bring these highlights down a little bit with a highlight slider. So listen, now this is really important. Now, 2019 was a very critical year in photography because it introduced us to the multi-exposure HDR. And this is different from normal HDR because if you remember a few years ago, HDR was horrible. It relied on one photo. So you imported one photo into some software, and the HDR tried its best to crush highlights and lift shadows, and the result was terrible. You had terrible haloing, and HDR was just miserable. So now, this is where I'm talking. 2019 was the year HDR really came into its own. It really, and here's why. I have a Fujifilm X-H1, and it's capable of taking multiple exposures, right? You put the camera on a tripod, and you can either set it for 3, 5, 7, or 9 images. And when you press the shutter, you get that. You either get 3, 5, 7, or 9 images. And here's the deal. You set your increment for exposure bracketing, right? So what I currently do, like normally, if I don't have a high contrasty situation, I set it for, like, I take 3 exposures. It's like Provia, and then classic chrome, and then acros, okay, because I want that variation. But I can turn my bracketing wheel, I can turn it to bracketing, and then I go into the menu and set it for exposure bracketing. And this is what I'm getting at. So you set your increment between the different values. And what I usually do, now you can set it for 1/3 of a stop, a full stop. I choose 2/3. So right here, 2/3 of a stop, okay? And then how many images do you want? And I usually go with 5. So my setting is I want 2/3 of a stop between each photo, and I want 5 photos. So what happens is, and now you would take some HDR software, right? So here, let me go back to this for a second. So you have a neutral, right? The camera kind of says, okay, what is a neutral value or a correct exposure? Then it takes another image, like again, in my situation, it would be 2/3 of a stop overexposed, and then another 2/3 for a full stop and a third overexposed, and the same going with underexposure. So the deal is, you take your 5 or 7 or 9 images, and you bring them into an HDR software platform. Okay, now again, 2006 to 2018, we're in Lightroom, and we're trying to use Lightroom. 2019 and now beyond, you've got 5 images imported into HDR software, and you choose the base image. And the base image you generally choose for the algorithm to work with is this one. You want the correct exposure, because that's the one the HDR software is going to use as the baseline. Okay, you import all 5 images into the software, and it evaluates all 5 images. So here's what would happen in current times. This overexposure, right? It would look to this. It would look to the underexposures and use the underexposures to compensate for this. Here, I really don't see the overexposures working too much, because again, the photographer looks like he grabbed this as a baseline, right? So it looks like the HDR software would basically discard the overexposures. It doesn't need it because the image is already overexposed. So the algorithm will look at these 2 images, right, and then bring down all these highlights with the underexposed, the 2 underexposed photos. Okay, so that's how modern HDR software would level out this image. Okay, now let's look at the other image. Okay, again, let's say I have 2/3 of a stop, right? I expose here. This is where I'm getting my meter reading, right? I expose for this. This is my 0, my neutral value. Okay, now to the contrary, you import these into the HDR software, and it's going to discard this. It's going to discard the underexposures, right? Because it wants this. This is what we need to correct. So the software is going to do the opposite here. It's going to look to the overexposures. It's going to look for these overexposures, and it's going to use the overexposures to blend this in, right? It's going to fill in this area, and it's going to really lift these shadows. So basically what we have is this image. We're discarding the underexposures, and we're going to lean on the overexposures to fill this in. Here, again, it's the opposite. We're going to discard the overexposures, and we're going to lean on the underexposures to bring down these highlights, right, to fill this in. So my point is, I know I'm kind of going long here, but what was so cool about these 2 images is that the Photoshop technician and the photographer completely abandoned these 2 routes. Abandoned this, and abandoned even lifting the shadows and bringing down the highlights. And went for this in these 2 photos. They both went for the 2005 and before to get these really binary images. And and they're beautiful in their own right, because it takes you back to the days of film, right? When you didn't have this luxury, you didn't have all this tweaking ability in either like a Lightroom, and especially here. So my point is, if you want to attempt something like this nowadays, right, this is a godsend. This is absolutely wonderful. These HDR platforms where, again, you take 5, 7, or 9 exposures, you import them. The algorithm looks at the image, and it does the tweaking all by itself. It looks at all the images and kind of flattens it so that it's one even image. So again, I just wanted to cover that for you, is if you want to shoot outdoors and you don't want contrasty images, you can explore this. This is the latest iteration. This is the first iteration. Then for 12, 13 years inclusive, we were living in this world, and now we're living in this world here. Okay, again, I know I went long. Thank you for your patience. If you enjoyed this, please give me a thumbs up, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you.